The Acadians are the descendants of French colonists who settled in Acadia during the 17th and 18th centuries, some of whom are also Métis. The colony was located in what is now eastern Canada's maritime provinces, as well as part of Quebec, and present-day Maine to the Kennebec River. Although today most of the Acadians and COIs are French-speaking Canadians, Acadia was a distinctly separate colony of New France. It was geographically and administratively separate from the French colony of Canada. As a result, the Acadians and COIs developed two distinct histories and cultures. They also developed a slightly different French language. France has one official language, and to accomplish this they have an administration in charge of the language. Since the Acadians were separated from this council, the French language evolved independently, and Acadians retained several elements of 17th-century French that have been lost in France. The settlers whose descendants became Acadians came from many areas in France, but especially regions such as Île-de-France, Normandy, Brittany, Poitou and Aquitaine. The Acadians lived for almost 80 years in Acadia, prior to the British siege of Port Royal in 1710. After the conquest, they lived under British rule for the next 45 years. During the French and Indian War, British colonial officers suspected they were aiding the French. The British, together with New England legislators and militia, carried out the Great Expulsion of 1755 to 1764. During and after the war years, they deported approximately 11,500 Acadians from the maritime region. Approximately one-third perished from disease and drowning, although one historian compared this event to contemporary ethnic cleansing. Other historians suggested that the event is comparable with other deportations in history. Many Acadians migrated to Spanish colonial Louisiana, present-day Louisiana state, where they developed what became known as Cajun culture. Others were transported to France. Some of those were settled secondarily to Louisiana by Henri Peyroux de la Coudronière. Later on, many Acadians returned to the maritime provinces of Canada, most specifically New Brunswick. Most who returned ended up in New Brunswick because they were barred by the British from resettling their lands and villages in the land that became Nova Scotia. Before the U.S. Revolutionary War, the Crown settled New England planters. Then after the war, Loyalists in former Acadian communities and farmland. British policy was to assimilate Acadians with the local populations where they resettled. Acadians speak a dialect of French called Acadian French. Many of those in the Moncton, New Brunswick area speak Kiakan English. The Louisiana Cajun descendants speak a dialect of American English called Cajun English, with several also speaking Cajun French, a close relative of the original dialect from Canada, later influenced by Spanish and West African languages. Pre-deportation history. During the 17th century, about 60 French families were established in Acadia. They developed friendly relations with the Wabanaki Confederacy, learning their hunting and fishing techniques. The Acadians lived mainly in the coastal regions of the Bay of Fundy, farming land reclaimed from the sea through diking, living in a contested borderland region between French Quebec and British territories. The Acadians often became entangled in the conflict between the powers. Over a period of 74 years, 6 wars took place in Acadia and Nova Scotia in which the Confederacy and some Acadians fought to keep the British from taking over the region. While France lost political control of Acadia in 1710, the Mi'kmaq did not concede land to the British. Along with some Acadians, the Mi'kmaq used military force to resist the founding of British settlements by making numerous raids on Halifax, Dartmouth, Lawrencetown and Lunenburg. During the French and Indian War, the Mi'kmaq assisted the Acadians in resisting the British during the expulsion of the Acadians. The British conquest of Acadia happened in 1710. Over the next 45 years the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. Many were influenced by Father Jean-Louis Le Loutre, who from his arrival in 1738 until his capture in 1755 preached against the English devils. During this time period Acadians participated in various militia operations against the British and maintained vital supply lines to the French fortress of Louisbourg and Fort Beauséjour. During the French and Indian War, the British sought to neutralize any military threat Acadians posed and to interrupt the vital supply lines Acadians provided to Louisbourg by deporting Acadians from Acadia. Many Acadians might have signed an unconditional oath to the British monarchy had the circumstances been better, while other Acadians did not sign because they were clearly anti-British. For the Acadians who might have signed an unconditional oath, there were numerous reasons why they did not. The difficulty was partly religious, in that the British monarch was the head of the Church of England. Another significant issue was that an oath might commit male Acadians to fight against France during wartime. A related concern was whether their Mi'kmaq neighbours might perceive this as acknowledging the British claim to Acadia rather than the Mi'kmaq. As a result, signing an unconditional oath might have put Acadian villages in dangers of attack from Mi'kmaq. In the Great Expulsion, after the Battle of Fort Beauséjour beginning in August 1755 under Lieutenant Governor Lawrence, approximately 11,500 Acadians were expelled, their lands and property confiscated, and in some cases their homes burned. The Acadians were deported throughout the British Eastern Seaboard colonies from New England to Georgia. Although measures were taken during the embarkation of the Acadians to the transport ship, some families became split up. Thousands were transported to France. Most of the Acadians who went to Louisiana were transported there from France on 5 Spanish ships provided by the Spanish crown to populate their Louisiana colony and provide farmers to supply New Orleans. The Spanish had hired agents to seek out the dispossessed Acadians in Brittany, and the effort was kept secret so as not to anger the French king. These new arrivals from France joined the earlier wave expelled from Acadia, creating the Cajun population and culture. The Spanish forced the Acadians they had transported to settle along the Mississippi River, to block British expansion, rather than western Louisiana where many of them had family and friends and where it was much easier to farm. Rebels among them marched to New Orleans and ousted the Spanish governor. The Spanish later sent infantry from other colonies to put down the rebellion and execute the leaders. After the rebellion in December of 1769, the Spanish governor O'Reilly permitted the Acadians who had settled across the river from Natchez to resettle on the Iberville or Amite River closer to New Orleans. A second and smaller expulsion occurred when the British took control of the north shore of what is now New Brunswick. After the fall of Quebec, the British lost interest and many Acadians returned to British North America, settling in coastal villages not occupied by American colonists. A few of these had evaded the British for several years, but the brutal winter weather eventually forced him to surrender. Some returnees settled in the region of Fort St. Anne, now Fredericton, but were later displaced by the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists after the American Revolution. In 2003, at the request of Acadian representatives, Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, issued a royal proclamation acknowledging the deportation and establishing July 28 as an annual day of commemoration. Beginning in 2005, the day is called the Great Upheaval on some English-language calendars. Geography. The Acadians today live predominantly in the Canadian Maritime Provinces, as well as parts of Quebec, Louisiana and Maine. In New Brunswick, Acadians inhabit the northern and eastern shores of New Brunswick, from Muscow Island, Isle-le-Mec including Caraquet in the center, all the way to Neguac in the southern part. Grande Anse in the eastern part and Campbellton through to St. Quentin in the northern part. Other groups of Acadians can be found in the Magdalen Islands and throughout other parts of Quebec. Many Acadians still live in and around the area of Madawaska, Maine, where the Acadians first landed and settled in what is now known as the St. John Valley. There are also Acadians in Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, such as Cheticamp, Isle Madame, and Clare. East and West Pubnico, located at the end of the province, are the oldest regions still Acadian. The Acadians settled on the land before the deportation and returned to some of the same exact land after the deportation. Still others can be found in the southern and western regions of New Brunswick, western Newfoundland and in New England. Many of these latter communities have faced varying degrees of assimilation. For many families in predominantly Anglophone communities, French language attrition has occurred, particularly in younger generations. The Acadians who settled in Louisiana after 1764, known as Cajuns, have had a dominant cultural influence in many parishes, particularly in the southwestern area of the state known as Acadiana culture. Today Acadians are a vibrant minority, particularly in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Louisiana, and northern Maine. Since 1994, Le Congrès Mondial Acadien has united Acadians of the Maritimes, New England, and Louisiana. August 15, the Feast of the Assumption, was adopted as the national feast day of the Acadians at the First Acadian National Convention, held in Memramcook, New Brunswick in 1881. On that day, the Acadians celebrate by having the Tintamarre, which consists mainly of a big parade where people can dress up with the colors of Acadia and make a lot of noise. The national anthem of the Acadians is Avenue, Maristella, adopted at Mascouche, Prince Edward Island in 1884. The anthem was revised at the 1992 meeting of the Société Nationale de l'Acadia, where the second, third and fourth verses were changed to French, with the first and last kept in the original Latin. The Fédération des Associations de Famille Acadienne of New Brunswick and the Société St. Thomas d'Aquin of Prince Edward Island has resolved that December 13 each year shall be commemorated as Acadian Remembrance Day, to commemorate the sinking of the Duke William and the nearly 2,000 Acadians deported from Isle St. John who perished in the North Atlantic from hunger, disease and drowning in 1758. The event has been commemorated annually since 2004 and participants mark the event by wearing a black star. Today, there are cartoons featuring Acadian characters and an Acadian show named Acadiman. Artistic commemorations of the expulsion in 1847. American writer Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published Evangeline, an epic poem loosely based on the events surrounding the 1755 deportation. The poem became an American classic, and contributed to a rebirth of Acadian identity in both maritime Canada and in Louisiana. In the early 20th century, two statues were made of Evangeline, one in St. Martinville, Louisiana and the other in Grand Prairie Acute, Nova Scotia, which both commemorate the expulsion. Robbie Robertson wrote a popular song based on the Acadian expulsion titled Acadian Driftwood, which appeared on the band's 1975 album, Northern Lights, Southern Cross. The Acadian Memorial honors those 3,000 who settled in Louisiana. Throughout the Canadian Maritime Provinces there are Acadian monuments to the expulsion, such as the one at George Island and Beaubears Island. Flags. The flag of the Acadians is the French tricolour with a golden star in the blue field, which symbolizes the Saint Mary, Our Lady of the Assumption, patron saint of the Acadians, and the Star of the Sea. This flag was adopted in 1884 at the Second Acadian National Convention, held in Mascouche, Prince Edward Island. Acadians in the diaspora have adopted other symbols. The flag of Acadians in Louisiana, known as Cajuns, was designed by Thomas J. Arsenault of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. and adopted by the Louisiana legislature as the official emblem of the Acadian region in 1974. A group of New England Acadians attending Le Congrès Mondial Acadien in Nova Scotia in 2004 endorsed a design for a New England Acadian flag by William Cork, and are advocating for its wider acceptance. Prominent Acadians. Notable Acadians in the 18th century include Noel Duran. Noel was one of more than 350 Acadians that perished on the Duke William on December 13, 1758. Noel was described by the captain of the Duke William as the father of the whole island, a reference to Noel's place of prominence among the Acadian residents of Isle Street. John, for his noble resignation and self-sacrifice aboard the Duke William. Noel was celebrated in popular print throughout the 19th century in England and America. Noel also is the namesake of the village Noel, Nova Scotia. Another prominent Acadian from the 18th century was militia leader Joseph Broussard, who joined French priest Jean-Louis Le Loutre in resisting the British occupation of Acadia. More recent notable Acadians include singers Angèle Arsenault and Edith Butler, singer Jean-François Brault, writer Antonine Maillet, film director Phil Comeau, singer-songwriter Julie Duran, artist Phoebe Leger, boxers Yvonne Durel and Jacques Leblanc, pitcher Réal Cormier, former Governor-General Roméo Leblanc, former Premier of Prince Edward Island, Auburn Edmond Arsenault, the first Acadian Premier of any province and the first Acadian appointed to a provincial Supreme Court, Auburn Edmond Arsenault's father, Joseph Octave Arsenault, the first Acadian appointed to the Canadian Senate from Prince Edward Island, Peter John Veniot, first Acadian Premier of New Brunswick, and former New Brunswick Premier Louis Robichaud, who was responsible for modernizing education and the government of New Brunswick in the mid-20th century.